Welcome to the Common Cool podcast,
where we discuss the power of addiction,
the art of suffering,
and the joy of freedom.
Hello. Welcome to the Common Cool podcast. My name is Miguel.
I'm Jeff. And today we have Rebecca Kase with us. I worked with Rebecca we couldn't figure it out, like 6 years ago. I'm not sure. Time just seems to fly by. We worked in community mental health together. She was actually my supervisor when we were working in community mental health. And I remember those years. I always loved those years of working in community mental health. And I think it really is important. I mean, I guess I'm going to soapbox it for a half second. Like, important for therapists to like come up and see some community mental health and get experience through health. And, so I met Rebecca there, and we didn't spend a whole heck of a lot of time together there. But since that time, she was a leader there in community mental health, and she has continued to be a leader. And now she is running her own, EMDR, training. I guess you want to call it a facility, but service that she's been growing for many years. And she is one of the top EMDR trainers in America now. And she has recently wrote a book, like within the last year, right, Rebecca?
I wrote it. Yeah, it came out in 2023. So it was birthed in 2022.
Okay. Yeah. The book is named Polyvagal-Informed EMDR, a Neuro-Informed Approach to Healing, which is something that Miguel and I are really interested in. Anything that has to do with the brain. And also, which was really interesting, the neurological approach to training too, like helping therapists to understand themselves, which I think is way beyond what happens in a lot of EMDR training courses, where you're not just growing a training program, you're growing like a community of EMDR therapists that are really healthy. So I'll let you talk. Hey, we got one more second. We were talking, like, we wanted to get you in, to hear what you're up to, but also to hear about in the addiction world. I have experience, being a clinical director and being, working with discharge teams, that there are a lot of clients that are told, like, you really need trauma treatment. And then they leave rehab, which they do what we tell them to do. Go to meetings first. But there's typically, like, from my experience, that's where they stop their treatment is in a support group, and they don't tend to like move on and seek out trauma treatment. So that's what we were just hearing about, today, about trauma treatment and EMDR. And I will officially stop talking. But thanks for coming, Rebecca.
Happy to be here. Yeah. I think that when we say you need trauma treatment, I mean, first off, I think that's hard for some people to hear. Like, oh, I need trauma treatment. Something's wrong with me. Do I have trauma? Because so often I think we think of trauma as like these big T events, like combat trauma, sexual assault, physical abuse. But trauma isn't about the experience. It's about the response to it. And I think we've had our perspective on what is quote unquote trauma wrong, like, this whole time, because it's always defined by, is it on this list that we would consider this experience to be traumatic? But really, what defines something as traumatic is how your nervous system responds to it. And I might go through something and it doesn't impact me too significantly, and somebody else goes through it and it's really big. And so regardless of what it is, what's important is to look at, did your nervous system respond to an event or an ongoing event with a really big stress response that's had a lasting negative impact on you? And if so, you could consider that to be trauma, per how your nervous system experiences it. Because, your body doesn't sit there and like, oh, okay, is this experience on this list? And if so, then I will cue this response. Like, your nervous system is just automatically responding to experiences that it perceives to be dangerous or safe. And it does so with a set of biological kind of hardwired responses: fight, flight, freeze, and faint. And it's all based on how you perceive that experience. And so trauma is not an objective experience, it's a subjective experience. And if you're like, well, I don't think I have trauma, and they told me I need to go to trauma treatment, essentially what somebody is recommending is like, I see that you have a lasting negative impact of some adverse things that have happened to you. Like some shit has happened and it seems to really be mucking you up. So maybe it's time to go get some therapy for that. And of course, like addictions are so highly correlated with that because we're just going to naturally look to soothe ourselves when, fight, flight, freeze, and faint responses feel freaking terrible, right? Like it just feels awful. Like we all know what those experiences feel like because we have a body designed to respond to stress. And so if you're stuck in those states for prolonged periods of time, of course, a bottle of wine sounds like a good idea. Or of course, like a couple of Xanax sound good. Or of course, like binge eating the whole box of Oreos seems to work out because your nervous system is just focused on, I feel better, so I'm going to do that again. And your nervous system doesn't necessarily perceive like, I feel better, but that's going to cause us a lot of problems down the road. So I think that is a really important thing for us to be able to reframe, and is also partly what helps us to destigmatize addiction of like, of course you're just trying to soothe. Of course.
When pain is not something that, people who struggle with addiction do well, So the first step for them is to like convince them to like move away from those things that soothe them, and try to live life without them. And then they're asked to kind of like move forward and have a life and create. And 12 Steps does an amazing job of that. We had someone speak a couple of weeks ago, and she made it very well known. She has as a therapist, as a like trauma treatment, she'd made a comment about like 12 Step does not address trauma. And I thought about that, like, yeah. And of course, I started picking it apart a little bit. Like, well, it addresses some parts of it, but like, it doesn't really, I don't know if you're familiar with 12 Step.
Oh, yes. Yes. So I'll share that I have a history of struggling with abusing alcohol to try and self-soothe myself. I have a trauma history. I have healed from PTSD. I went through a very wild ride in my teenage years, in my 20s, and was a wild child and a party girl, and was in a really unhealthy, toxic, abusive relationship with somebody who was a very heavy addict with drugs and alcohol. And I look back on those times in my life, and it was a very dark time for me, and I almost did not survive with my life. I was in a very dark place. And I recognized like the way I am using alcohol, the way I'm living my life, this relationship, this is problematic. I remember I woke up one day and like I heard God say to me, you are going to ruin everything if you continue down this path. And I had a friend who had been sober for a couple of years. They had been struggling with addiction, and I called him and I talked to him and had a very vulnerable conversation. He'd like, let me take you to 12 Steps. And so I went to AA, and I went to AA quite a bit in the beginning of that journey. And what I kind of disagree that AA or 12 Steps isn't trauma focused, because it gives you a safe space to talk about the shit that is just like so shameful and you feel so terrible about and you think nobody understands. And that is absolutely trauma therapy. I believe so. Like, are you sitting there and like reprocessing your trauma with each other? No. But like for me, AA was the first place that I could share the dark things in my mind and people be like, yeah, I get you. You want to go get coffee? And like when I was really struggling, like I had a list of phone numbers to text. And I remember the first time that I was able to get past a desire to drink using the knowledge that I had from AA, right? So I used to have FOMO. Friday night, I'm home alone. I'm not going out with everybody because all of my friend group at that time is like, what are you doing? You're going to the bar, you're taking shots, right? Like you're drinking. And I was like, I'm staying home. And it was so hard. I was like, I don't know how to get through this. Like, I just really want some wine right now. And I was like, what did they teach you in AA? Sit down and pray. And I sat down and I recited the Serenity Prayer for probably an hour long. And the urge like passed. And that was like the moment that I was like, I can do this. I can totally do this. And I'll say even to this day, like the Serenity Prayer, I mean, you don't have to go to 12 steps or be a recovering addict for that prayer to give you like some light into like sanity, right? Like I think we could all use that prayer. And I go back to it all the time when I'm just feeling mixed up and at a loss and overwhelmed.
That's amazing. And I mean, to that point, we've talked about this in the podcast that 12 steps can help not just addicts. It's like the whole 12 steps, it's a toolkit that could help really anybody traverse any kind of problem that you have in your life. So it's super, super powerful. So it's really cool to hear your opinion on how, joining a 12-step community can start addressing trauma. One very specific question about that for you is, it feels like it's the fourth step, right? Where you start really unpacking some of the past and things that happen. And, in some cases, in every case, you also try to look at what was your part in those things. From your professional perspective, being an expert in trauma, how does that start addressing trauma from your point of view?
Well, I think about that, most of us are not responsible for the shit that has happened to us, but like you're the only person coming to save yourself. Like nobody is coming to save you. There is no like idiot on some horse in some shiny material saying, here I am for you. Like, thank God anyway, right? Like, I don't want to have to wait on somebody else. So I think that what the 12 steps can help you do is like get right with yourself so you can even figure out where to start. And I mean, I think that we all need to sit down and get right with ourselves because everybody, right? Like we all have addictive patterns. And sometimes I struggle with the term, not sometimes, I do struggle with the term like I'm an addict or they're an addict because of what that word means in our society. It's so stigmatizing and it's so shameful. And I see it as like, I'm a human being with a nervous system that was really suffering because of shit that I didn't necessarily like do to myself. I wasn't helping myself in those moments. So yeah, I found some ways to self-soothe and that got me really mixed up and I'm doing better now. And I've figured some things out, because we all have addictions. We all have maladaptive habits, right? Whether it's exercising too much or working too much or eating too many Oreos or avoiding people or loneliness or isolation or despair or victimization. Like we all have things that our brains get hooked onto because it helps us to feel better in some way. And if we want to change and we want to grow, if you want to thrive, you do have to sit down and say like, how am I contributing to my suffering? Whether that's the choices that I'm making with, what I'm ingesting or how I'm spending my time or who I hang out with or where I allow my mind to go. Because it's only you and yourself at the end of the day. Like nobody is coming for you. Nobody is going to regulate you. Like you have to show up for yourself. And I think for me, I personally haven't been to a 12-step meeting in years. Like it really helps me in the beginning, like get right and get straight and like have some big aha moments and be like, oh, okay, like I got it. I know where to go. But it really helps me to look in the mirror in a way that didn't feel like, look at yourself, you terrible person, right? Like it helps me be like, oh yeah, like I'm not alone in this. Of course, like, of course this makes sense. And now what are you going to do about it?
Yeah. I love the way that you frame a lot of this stuff up in like, look at the nervous system.
Yeah.
Look at a person's nervous system and, they could have been in a horrific car accident and nothing. And they could have been, embarrassed by their parent at a school event. And that could have just racked their world. Things that we think are traumatic aren't necessarily the case. how do you go through that process with a person? Like, because, even as a therapist, there are times where I'm like, I hear something, and I say, that seems pretty traumatic, and I don't get that feedback from them. So how do you determine, like, if you have experienced a trauma and also, what you can do to kind of start to approach that? And I think that's something gets oversaid in rehabs. Like, I think it's sometimes just like, deal with that after kind of thing. After the 20, 30 days, we're not set up to kind of deal with that right now.
Yeah. I mean, I think that as soon as if you go to rehab or you're going to intensive outpatient or whatever kind of programming, like that is the beginning. Like you're starting to change the way your nervous system is relating to the world. And I think that like go to trauma therapy again is like, I mean, everything can be trauma therapy depending on how you use it and how you view it. And so if you start to, get curious about what is my relationship with this substance and when do I tend to crave it? Like what's going on for me? Like where does this start? What does this serve? Like whatever you're addicted to, it is serving a purpose or you wouldn't do it. Right? Like it helps something. But it hurts more than it helps in the long run. Like otherwise you probably wouldn't be curious about doing this work in the first place. So I think the first place is just like, let me get curious and try to observe how I'm functioning, why I'm doing what I'm doing, why I'm choosing to do the things I'm doing at the times I am, and how have they been benefiting me? Well, I know if like you're somebody who struggles with addictions and maladaptive coping patterns, you're like, well, it doesn't benefit me, Rebecca. Like that's what I've been told. Like it does benefit you or you wouldn't be doing it, right? Like it benefits you maybe for 20 minutes and then it stops benefiting you. So you have to look at like, how has this helped me cope? And what are the repercussions of that? And if you look at, okay, so like I used to drink wine in efforts to solve loneliness. And I had to get curious about like, okay, so this is solving this. It feels like it solves it in the moment. It certainly doesn't solve it, but it soothes my nervous system. So if I can get curious about what my nervous system is after, I can start to look at other things to replace the wine, right? Like if my nervous system is after like a sense of connection and I'm trying to calm like overwhelming anxiety. I used to have panic attacks. Alcohol just made all that worse, but in the moment it feels like it makes it better. Okay. So I'm trying to soothe loneliness and I'm trying to soothe panic. Let me find some other strategies to go about that. And I think loneliness is a huge part of addiction. It's like a defined part of PTSD, like feeling isolated and separated from others, feeling lonely. And so of course, like your nervous system was wired and designed to form social bonds. Like we're one of the only mammals that come into this world without any capacity to survive on our own. So we're hardwired to connect, because if you weren't hardwired to connect, I promise you, like you would have been like, never mind, when your child wouldn't stop screaming at the grocery store because you told them, no, you can't have that lollipop, right? Like after the first time you had your heart broken as a teenager, you would have been like, never mind, that sucks. I'm not going to do that again. But we do it again and again and again and again because we're designed to form bonds. Like it is literally in your DNA. Everybody, even if you're an introvert, needs relationships. And so when we're struggling with unresolved trauma and when we are also struggling with addiction that, is kind of negatively viewed in our society versus if you have an addiction that people positively view, like you're hardcore about exercise or you work really hard and you're very well accomplished for that, right? So if you have something that is negatively viewed, it just increases that isolation because you feel like I can't talk to anybody about this. I can't be vulnerable about it. And my trauma just creates this separation for me. Like I feel like nobody understands me. And so when you isolate yourself in that way, you're just causing your nervous system to kind of get more inflamed because you're going against like what your nervous system needs. It's like putting a plant in a dark room and expecting that it's going to thrive. Like we just don't thrive in isolation. That's why it's like one of the worst things you can do to a human being, right? To put them into isolation. So I think we can view kind of every step of the way from like the first moment you step into rehab or the first moment you call a rehab or the first time you like start Googling like trauma therapy. What the hell is that? And like, what is this meditation thing? I hear that's good. And what are these supplements that might help me? Like all of that is part of the recovery. All of that is part of healing because it's all about what does my nervous system need to thrive? How do I thrive? And your nervous system is going to thrive and heal from a whole lot of different interventions. And trauma therapy is certainly one of them.
Right. So what you're saying is it really takes a holistic approach of combining all these different things, right? Meditation, trauma therapy, potentially 12 steps, etc. So speaking of different sort of tools that can help, I would love to spend a little bit of time with you describing a little bit more what EMDR is, how is it used in trauma therapy? How can it help people and what kinds of people should look for this kind of therapy?
Yeah. So EMDR stands for eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. It's a ridiculously long name, so I just call it EMDR. And it is an evidence-based treatment for PTSD and trauma. So what that means is that there's a whole heck of a lot of research that says this therapy works if you have this diagnosis or these types of symptoms. So EMDR is focused on the storage of memory. And EMDR is a memory-based therapy. And so this therapy asserts that when you go through overwhelming experiences, whether they're just really stressful, they were traumatic, you were too little, so you couldn't make sense of it, like you just didn't have a fully developed brain to understand what was going on. When our nervous system gets overwhelmed like that, sometimes our brain stores memories maladaptively. And so when our brain stores memories maladaptively, that leads to a whole bunch of symptoms and flavors of suffering. So you can kind of think similarly to your digestive tract. When you eat too much food, you don't tend to feel good, right? Like you're like, I'm bloated and I'm nauseous and I'm gassy and I feel terrible. So your nervous system is kind of the same. When it gets overwhelmed, instead of gas and bloating, you might have panic attacks and anxiety and overwhelming fear and hypervigilance and nightmares and flashbacks and depression and all those things. You can see all those symptoms as your nervous system saying, hey, I'm not okay. I need some help. We're not doing all right here. So EMDR focuses on helping to reprocess those maladaptively stored memories to a point of adaptive resolution, which simply means that you work with your therapist on reprocessing those memories that are stuck and causing yuck to a point that you're like, oh my gosh, it just doesn't bother me. It's not like your therapist erased the memory. It's not like it's gone, but it just doesn't hurt anymore. So when you think of it, when it's recalled, you're like, oh yeah, that kind of sucked, but I recognize I'm so strong and it just doesn't activate me. I don't feel any stress. And so you work with your therapist to identify what are the memories that seem to be causing the symptoms for you. Like there's a whole approach in EMDR in which you kind of excavate and you discover what are the memories that are stuck and causing yuck. And then EMDR uses a technique called bilateral stimulation to help your nervous system process those. And so that's eye movements that move back and forth, or tapping that you can tap back and forth on your shoulders or on your knees, or audio tones that beat back and forth in your ears. I know that sounds weird. I know it sounds super strange. There's a lot of research that supports it, though. I promise for your listeners that like this isn't hocus pocus. There's like real neurobiological stuff happening there. I won't go into that because like that could be a whole thing. But it really works. And EMDR is useful for any age. So kids can receive EMDR. Kids process super, super fast because they don't have all these memories. They don't have these years and decades of experience of complex things that have like connected and fired and wired together, kind of like a lot of backup in your colon. They don't have a lot of backup in your memory networks because of years of like miseating. But you can use it as with teens, you can use it adults. older adults, like it works throughout the lifespan. It works. I mean, EMDR is practiced on every continent. It's practiced across cultures. It is a worldly recognized first-line treatment for trauma. And EMDR is also shown to be effective with anxiety, with chronic pain, with grief and loss, with depression. And there's some evidence that it can also help with addiction. So whether that's we're going to reprocess your trauma experiences or those overwhelming experiences that are stuck in causing yuck, and that will reduce your cravings or your urges or like the positive maladaptive association your nervous system has made. So there's like a positive maladaptive association, right? Like I drink because it feels good when I drink, because it feels so good, right? And so sometimes we have to like unhook that like positive maladaptive association. And then there's some evidence that EMDR may help with just like there's some specific protocols that focus on reducing like triggers that lead to cravings. There's protocols that focus on reducing the urges that can activate relapse or use. It's not evidence-based specifically for addictions, but given the relationship between addictions and trauma, it can be incredibly impactful. And I've received EMDR myself several times throughout my life. I mean, I've used it to work on my big traumas, my small traumas, like little things, big things. And it is like always in my personal medicine cabinet. When hard stuff happens, I'm like, EMDR therapist, like as soon as possible. So I highly recommend it professionally and personally.
Yeah, me too. Like I love that. I love it. I actually did it like 10 years ago. I was involved with a therapist that we did EMDR for like a year, which was super successful. And I think the thing with it is sometimes it's like, it sounds like so serious. Sometimes it sounds like we're going to go do some EMDR. And I think sometimes it's scary. Like, is trauma treatment scary? And it sounds, and when you start talking about EMDR, it's like, oh, like you're going to get into this situation where they start doing these things and you're not going to be able to get out of it. And I've had to talk to a lot of people about like that. That's not how it actually rolls. That's not how it is. I think there's that absolute fear of like that, especially with, well, like we said, with anyone, like that feel of getting out of control and the pain that kind of comes with that feeling of kind of getting out of control and then not being able to kind of reel yourself back in. Cause that's addiction, as far as I'm concerned, you're out of control and you can't reel yourself back in.
And just out of curiosity to have people get a very clear idea of what this looks like, what does the whole experience look like? Like I come over, let's say I was going to do EMDR. I come to your office, we talk perhaps, and then maybe there's multiple sessions. So just walk us through that whole process of what does it look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, not all EMDR therapists are created equal, just like not all therapists are created equal. So you want to make sure that you're working with someone who is properly and adequately trained, because there are some programs out there that are training therapists in EMDR and they're not really legitimate programs. And so a lot of the EMDR community holds some pretty significant concerns for like the competency of some of those clinicians. So if you are in North America, you want to ask that therapist if they were trained by an EMDRIA approved training provider. EMDRIA, EMDRIA, which is the EMDR International Association. If they say no, or I don't know, I would not go to that person for EMDR, because EMDRIA is like the regulating body for the standards of EMDR training in North America. So if somebody's not trained by an EMDRIA approved trainer, then no, I wouldn't do that because it might be really bad. But what it looks like otherwise is you should be starting. And again, I say should, because even if folks are trained by an EMDRIA approved trainer, sometimes they've gotten some drift from EMDR. And so if anything at any point feels like this doesn't feel like what Rebecca described, I would maybe hit the brakes and just ask some questions or look for a new therapist. So EMDR starts off with just building a relationship with your clinician, because safety and rapport in that relationship is the number one important thing, because you're working on vulnerable stuff. And if you don't feel safe with your therapist, like emotionally safe. Like I can let this person in to look at the skeletons in my closet and I won't have a vulnerability hangover afterwards. Like maybe they're not the right therapist for you, right? Because you're doing some heavy excavating work. So there needs to be a lot of safety and rapport. And then your therapist will work with you to make sure like, okay, do we have the types of skills in place so your nervous system won't feel that like I feel out of control when we work on those memories. And so that's phase 2 of EMDR. There's 8 phases of EMDR. So that first one is like getting to know your therapist. The second phase is building skills, preparing to reprocess memories. And so some folks come to therapy and like they already got all the skills. They're like, I'm ready. Let's trudge into the dark, right? I'm ready to slay the dragons. And some folks are like, I don't really know how to calm my panic attacks. I'm not sleeping well. Like I'm in an active relapse stage. You know, if you don't feel like you have a handle on your nervous system and it's handling you, then you need to spend some time in phase 2, like building some skills. So you do feel like I can work with my neurobiology. It doesn't feel out of control. And only once you have some skills in place, then you're like, okay, we're going to look at what are the memories that seem to be stuck and causing yuck. And so that's a whole process in EMDR where you identify what are the past experiences that are leading to these symptoms? What are the present day triggers that set them off? And what do you want for the future? And then you dive into processing those memories. And the first time you ever do EMDR, it can be like, well, that's a strange experience because it feels very different. You're not sitting there talking the whole time with your therapist. It's really like a show that happens inside. You sit there, you might close your eyes, you might not, but you're really just noticing these, you're like riding these waves as you desensitize that target, as you reprocess that target. And so you might feel like a rise of like some emotions, and then there's usually like a pretty quick, like a release of those. And so you work through that target. And so you get to a point of you're like, there's no more yuck coming up. It doesn't bother me. I feel fine. Actually, I feel peaceful. And usually there's this moment in that process where a couple of really profound moments. So one, clients pretty much always have these incredible insights that just come to you on your own. Like I remember working with a client once who had been sexually assaulted and she was having suicidal ideations because she felt so ashamed. She felt like it was her fault. And I could have done all the work that a therapist normally would do of like, let's identify all the ways it wasn't your fault. But in processing that sexual assault, she got there on her own. She was like, oh my God, it wasn't my fault. And this incredible like aha that is like some of the most powerful moments of healing for you, where you have these insights. And then to get to the end of working through that and you think about this memory, and people usually have this like jaw drop of like, Rebecca, it doesn't bother me. How does this not upset me? Like it doesn't hurt. I don't feel anxious. Like I actually just feel really peaceful and calm when I think of it. And it's like, it's incredible. So if you're nervous and you're scared to go through it, of course, like our brains are always like nervous and scared to do something that feels kind of big that we haven't done before because you don't have a script for it, right? But just like hear these words that like, what is on the other side of that work is like these moments and insights and like points of change and shift and lift for you that are like you couldn't even dream. They're just so profound. And I haven't ever seen any therapy that produces those kinds of results for folks that also maintains. Like it doesn't wear off. It's not like, okay, come back in 6 months for a tune-up. It's like, actually the research shows you will continue to get better after EMDR, even if you stop going to therapy.
Wow. That's super powerful. Makes me want to try to pursue the treatment myself.
Everybody should go to EMDR. I mean, can you imagine our society if like all of our politicians went and got some EMDR therapy?
Wow. Oh, my God. That would be game changing.
If you don't do it for yourself, do it for your community and loved ones. Be a better human. Go to EMDR.
Are there people for which it wouldn't work for whatever reason?
I would say, I mean, I think that there could be there are some presentations that I might say, maybe EMDR isn't the right path right now. So if somebody is, to work on reprocessing those memories, like you wouldn't want to do that if you're in like a really acute phase of like mental health kind of flare ups and like you're just really unstable. Things are really risky. EMDR, if you have like a TBI or some kind of neurological kind of issue. I've used EMDR. I've worked with veterans a lot. And so like all my vets have TBIs pretty much because they're all combat vets. EMDR has done great with them. But sometimes there's some considerations we need to be mindful of if somebody has a TBI so we don't kind of exacerbate any symptoms associated with that. And of course, you have to be wanting to do the work. So sometimes it might be like, yeah, I don't recommend EMDR because you're not really wanting to excavate and reprocess those memories. But EMDR is also shown to be effective with recent traumatic events as well. So even if it's like I'm actively going through something's really fresh, EMDR has been shown to be really impactful of reducing acute symptoms associated with trauma. And we believe that it is preventative of someone going on to develop a really like significant condition, like, that trauma to into like full-blown PTSD or depression. And I'll say that the biggest trauma in my life that I have ever lived through, a week after it happened, I went and saw a therapist for EMDR. And it was a trauma that unfolded over a couple of years, but I don't know that I would have been able to like navigate that experience as well as I did if I hadn't received EMDR right in the beginning. Like it got some of like the really gruesome images out of my head and just it stopped my flashbacks that I was having pretty quickly. So even if something's super fresh, you can still go get EMDR. Like if something happens today, you can go tomorrow.
Yeah, that's awesome. Awesome information. Just knowing that it's available and it's something you said, like you have to do the work. And that's kind of been our, it feels like our battle cry for the last 3 or 4 episodes ago. Like it always comes down to like, you have to do the work. Like it's not a miracle. It's not like going to work if you're not working at it, or not committed to it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so many people are looking for like, what's the hack? What's the magic pill? And like your nervous system doesn't work like that, y'all. Like it just doesn't work like that. You have to feel to heal. And if you're not going to feel it, it won't be able to heal because it's got to move through your neurobiology. You have to build new neural networks. That's really what healing takes. It requires neuroplasticity, building new neural networks. And you only build new neural networks by exposing yourself to stuff that'll help you learn and create those pathways. And that doesn't come with a pill. Like pills do not build new neural networks. They change your chemistry.
Yeah. I was reading this piece the other day about neuroplasticity and really drove home the point that neuroplasticity requires work. It requires effort. In fact, if you look at the neurotransmitters, chemicals that ignited, which is all part of the catecholamine system, right? Dopamine, norepinephrine, like all those things need sort of intense sort of circumstances to sort of ignite, right? So you need like this going at it sort of like attitude to really turn on neuroplasticity, which is really interesting.
It is. And I kind of think of it akin to, if you're like, I want to go to the gym and work out and get a 6-pack, right? Like we got to go do the work. Sure, you can get like those machines, right? That I don't know, constrict your abs for you. But if you're like, I want to work out to be healthy and toned overall. Like I want my body to be in good shape. Like you're not going to get there by laying there and having some machine do it for you or taking a supplement. Like you have to go to the gym. You have to get out there and run. You have to like whatever it is. Like I was saying earlier, and I think we're all on the same page with like nobody's coming to save you. You got to do the work, and a pill's not coming to save you either. Yeah.
Yeah. When you said neuro-informed counseling, can you explain that? Like.
Yeah. So Neuro-Informed Counseling is a term that's not my term. That was, I was out there in the world before I wrote that book. But Neuro-Informed, I know I hadn't really heard of it too much until I started really doing the research for this book. And I was like, why are more people thinking about Neuro-Informed Counseling? Because really what that means is you're focusing on the nervous system as the focus of assessment, intervention, and outcome, right? Like as a therapist, the organ that I treat is my client's neurobiology. So if I'm a podiatrist, I'm going to focus on your foot. And if I'm a cardiologist, I'm going to focus on your heart. And I'm a therapist. So all diagnoses, addiction, trauma, all of that is about how your nervous system is functioning. In a way, I really see my clients as like, my client is my client's nervous system, right? And my job is to get really curious and attuned to how it's speaking to me, how it's speaking to my client, and how my client is speaking back to it, right? Because all of our clinical symptoms and complaints and pesky, like mental health issues, or even joy and happiness, peace and love and wellness is all made possible by stuff that's happening between your neurons. So it's all about your nervous system. And I think if we shifted in our counseling field to really looking at the nervous system as the focus of assessment, it's what I'm providing interventions to, and it's what I'm tracking to see if those interventions are working. I mean, that becomes so freeing because now it's not about a DSM diagnosis or, what cluster of symptoms do you have that fit what? It's about what is your nervous system telling me? And your nervous system speaks. It's data points. It's language. Are the flashbacks? Are the urges? Are the cravings? Are the loneliness? And I think if we learn to befriend our nervous system and say, like, oh, you're speaking to me, I should listen, instead of you're speaking to me, shut the F up, right? Like take a pill and stop it. Something's wrong with me. Let me stuff it down, right? Like you wouldn't say that to somebody who's having an asthma attack. Knock it off. Stop it. It's all in your head, right? You'd be like, oh my gosh, let me respond to you. What do you need? Do I need to go to the hospital, right? So your nervous system is the same. Everything is about physiological processes that are happening.
That's cool. Yeah. That's amazing. Is there anything that you work with? And I know, Miguel, you probably have a beat on some of this stuff like tech, or biomarkers or things that measure. I know we've had a couple of people on that promote. Evian has a biomarker thing. A guy who was our first episode. Is there anything that you work with to kind of measure any of that stuff?
Gosh, I wish, but like our field, right? I know it's so ridiculous. I mean, cause like, Jeff, do you consider yourself to be a health professional as a therapist?
Yeah. Well,
yeah, so do I.
Yeah. I didn't think of the question, Troy. I'm like, yeah, I do. Yeah.
Yeah, I do too. And
I want discounts on yoga.
Yeah. I want discounts on yoga. And, so if you went to your doctor and you're like, I'm having heart palpitations, and they didn't do an EKG. They didn't even like listen to your heart. And they're like, you are having a heart attack. We need to rush you into bypass surgery. Right. And you'd be like, no way. Like you didn't actually look at the thing you're saying you need to operate on. But our field, because mental health is seen as separate from physical health, so we have different standards of practice, right? Like we don't have all those machines and contraptions. And I mean, I would love if as part of like a standard intake, it was like, go get a scan of your brain, right? Like I want a full blood workup. I want a genealogy report. Like I want all of these things. I want to see your heart rate variability. I want to see what your respiration looks like. What are you eating? Bring me a diet record, right? I wish that was part of our practice, but it's not. And so while there's some things I can ask my clients to do, like let's sit down and tell me what you're eating. Because there's sometimes like you're not having panic attacks because of trauma. You're having panic attacks because you're drinking 3 pots of coffee a day. Like it doesn't need a clinical intervention, right? You just need to work on what you're eating. But I think until our field is seen as part of healthcare, we'll continue to have separate standards. And so I wish that I had tools and assessments that I could standardly use. I mean, I have, questionnaires that clients can fill out. I I wouldn't recommend those for like self-help necessarily, because sometimes you take those questionnaires and it's like WebMDing yourself, before you know it, you're like dying of some disease that hasn't been seen since like 1742. So I wish that we had that, but I think in place of having those kinds of standards, we can use theories that really focus on the nervous system. So EMDR is focused on the nervous system. Polyvagal theory is focused on the nervous system. And we can understand ourselves through that lens with the sense of curiosity.
Yeah. And I think, the good news is that there's a bunch of engineers and AI professionals that are kind of working on ways to figure out how to get a continuous measurement, so that people can infer, is this person getting better or worse? I want to ask a question before we run out of time that I think may be interesting for the watcher. Since you're a trauma expert, I feel like I can ask you this question. So how come some of us experience childhood trauma because of our parents, because of how they were with each other or towards us, that goes very deeply, or so deeply that when we're adults, we almost chase things, situations of people that almost recreates that trauma pattern, right? You see it in relationships. Maybe there was an abusive parent towards an abusive kid. Now that kid grows up and can't stop but having one after the other abusive relationships, romantic relationships. Why does that happen?
Yeah, I think that can happen for lots of different reasons. But one I think very common reason is that, well, that's the only schema that you know, right? And so when you're after, again, we're all wired for connections. So we will connect to something, even if it's not good for us, like unhealthy relationships or alcohol or sex, or like we're going to connect to something. And when we grow up in kind of unhealthy or, with parents who have unresolved trauma, generational trauma, this is what we're talking about, right? Generational trauma begets trauma begets trauma. And so when we grow up in that kind of setting, I think it sets us up to be in unhealthy relationships. One, because your nervous system was influenced how you developed, right? And so what kinds of symptoms emerged because of those adverse childhood experiences that just made you prime to get into one of those relationships. So for example, if you're growing up and you have a really anxious nervous system because of adversity you experienced, and you have learned to turn to alcohol to self-regulate, will make sense that maybe you meet somebody at the bar when you're out one night. You have so much fun bonding over shots and staying up late together and going on binges that your nervous system is like, oh, here's the connection I've been craving, right? So was it that like your attachment template was off, or was it just like my trauma symptoms, the way I've been like interacting with them just set me up to find other people who also have unresolved trauma, right? But then I think the other component, of course, is that, well, that's what I learned. That's what I learned attachment looks like. And so when I see that in someone else, like that's what my nervous system is used to. So I had mentioned that I was in a really unhealthy relationship for a while. And I look back on that now and I consider myself to be a very empowered, independent, strong woman. I'm like, how the hell did you get there? Right? Like the power of attachment, because it was this relationship that even though it was so terrible and abusive at times, when we were in that honeymoon phase and it was good, my nervous system got like all the neurochemicals that it was craving for. And so that was enough to make my system be like, I'm attaching to this because I don't have anywhere else that I get this dump, right? Of like good feelings. I don't get all this oxytocin and dopamine. And that became an addiction because like those moments of like, I feel safe and connected with this person overrode the moments of like fear and hurt and pain and terrible things being yelled at me and like hands being swung and right. Like it overrides it because it just like addiction, like, oh gosh, but that shot feels so good in that moment. How good it feels is more powerful than how bad it feels an hour later.
Yeah, that's the only person that can give me that fix. And if it's days and weeks apart, I'll wait around and take the abuse for it. I'll take everything just so I can get that fix.
Just so I can get that. And, when I met my husband after that relationship, my husband is amazing. And we have like he's an awesome guy. And when we first met, we dated for a couple of months, and then I broke up with him because I was like, this is like boring. And then thank God we got back together, and we laugh at that now, but it was really my nervous system was like, I don't know what to do without the chaos. Like that, I didn't know what to do with constant safety, because when you're struggling with addiction and maladaptive coping patterns, your nervous system is not used to peace. And peace sometimes feels like death. It feels like danger. It feels boring because like your perspective is just kind of so screwed up, right? Like you see like chaos and constant struggle and anxiety and like suffering inside is like, this is normal. You don't know that there's something else. Yeah.
I know we have to wrap up, and I want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing. This is going to be super helpful to the people that we're trying to reach and trying to, get healthy, help to get healthy. Congratulations on all your success. It's amazing what you're doing. Is there anything else you want to share before you jump off?
No, thanks so much, guys. This was,
thank you for the information, but also for the vulnerability. You opened up, told us about your story. Thank you for that. That helps a lot of people to understand addiction better and to reduce the stigma that there's out there. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely.
Okay. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you.